Today we're going to have presenting a hot science panel which is based around the ARC grant that was picked up in 2008, linkage grant, full title of which is the title of our panel today, which is Hot Science Global Citizens, the Agency of the Museum Sector in Climate Change Interventions. And I won't introduce the players in that because I believe Fiona's going to do that when we begin. Today we're going to have, we originally had 4 panellists. Unfortunately, there's a few apologies. Juan Salazar was unfortunately unable to make it today, so he sends his apologies. So that gives us 3 speakers in the first half of the session. And then after the break, we have Mariella Hatfield, who will be presenting her documentary. We had your Future Makers on the schedule at one stage, but it's the Future Makers, which will be followed by a discussion. So, in the first half, we've got Fiona Cameron, followed by Brett Nielsen, and Bob Hodge, who will be presenting in absentia. We have a very thin version of Bob sitting over there, thin round version of Bob, and he'll be speaking. So it's a big sort of multimedia event today. I won't go on because we do have a lot to say, so I think I'll just hand it over to Fiona. Fiona is Senior Research Fellow at CCR. She researches and writes on museums and contemporary societies with projects in 2 areas of interest. The first examines the agency of the museum sector in public culture in the representation of hot topics, most recently climate change. The second investigates digital technologies and museum collections within global flows. Fiona is the CI1 for the ARC linkage Hot Science Global Citizens, the agency of the museum sector in climate change interventions. Segue to Fiona.
Well, thank you, Cameron. Now, I'm just going to start to give you a brief overview of Hot Science Global Citizens and its aims just very generally. This project is an ARC linkage. It critically examines and explores the roles of museums, that's natural history, science museums and science centres, as places to educate, provide information, activate, broker discussions and decisions around climate change matters, locally and transnationally. Now, there is a theoretical, empirical research and programming component to this project. Due to its scale and complexity, the project has been divided into 3 strands. Strand 1, Museum Interventions and Institutional Forms, led by myself with Brett, is an investigation into the current and potential interventions of museums in climate change and new institutional forms. Strand 2, Science Humanities Interfaces, led by Bob Hodge with Jan Conroy and David Caroli, investigates how institutions currently and potentially might engage climate change more meaningfully in programming as both a scientific and a cultural issue. And Strand 3, Citizenship and Media, is led by Juan Salazar, also with Bob and David, that explores media, mainstream and community, and undertakes a critical analysis of how these sources engage, present and communicate climate change and how this might be deployed in the museum context. Now, climate change, according to my observations, is a mobile collection of heterogeneous elements, events and effects, from messages that urge us to reduce energy consumption, to discussions leading up to Copenhagen regarding the management of the atmosphere, to the calculations, data modelling of scientists about future scenarios, to heated debates between the Labour Party and Liberal opposition about the implementation of an emissions trading scheme in Australia, and to calls from Pacific Island people for the Australian government to commit to a rigorous emissions reduction scheme in order to protect their estates from sea level rise, refugee immigration quotas to an unseasonably warm winter. Now, all these things, physical, cultural and social, act on each other, are multi-scaled, none are separate. Clearly, climate change governmentalities are hybrids of social and physical elements, dynamic, interactive, contested, always on the move, in the process of becoming, challenged and at once stabilised by various events. Climate change governmentality, however, is framed as a problem on the basis of normative views around science and economics, managing populations, their habits and lifestyles, and neoliberal formations where climate change is cast as an economic issue, with market mechanisms offering cost-effective technological solutions. So therefore, it's hardly surprising that Foucault governmentality, namely biopower and advanced liberal or neoliberal government, in its various iterations, is widely and almost exclusively used by contemporary theorists to conceptualise and analyse contemporary climate change governance and policy development. And that's across a range of disciplines, from cultural studies, anthropology, cultural geography and environmental planning, along with Beck's World Risk Society. Now, considering that Foucauldian governmentality is so dominant in climate change analysis, and in my search for a way to posit museums in broader climate change governmentality flows, I naturally turned to Tony Bennett's formative work on the birth of the museum in relation to the early modern state, to consider how this might work or not in terms of climate change governmentality flows in a complex contemporary world. So in this paper, I'm going to be discussing Foucauldian governmentality and, to a lesser extent, Beck's World Risk Society as dominant modalities used to conceptualise and analyse climate change governance, its limits and roles of museums in these formations. I then pose a new theoretical form and method, liquid governmentalities, based on systems theories, Bauman's liquid modernity, Urey's global complexity, and Deleuze, Guattari and Delander's assemblages, as an alternative way of imagining climate change governmentality that more purposely reflects the contemporary complex, entangled, transnational climate change governmentality flows. I then link these ideas to the ways museums as governmental devices have been imagined, used and might be deployed in climate change governmentality. Foucault defines governmentality as an ensemble formed by institutions, procedures, analyses and reflections, calculations and tactics, which exercises a particular and complex form of power, targets the population, is the principal form of knowledge, political economy and security, used to secure the welfare and improvement of the condition of the population, its wealth, longevity, health, etc. Now, according to biopower, the dominant model of social change and climate change governmentality is to manage and discipline the population and the rational citizen through moralising and reforming behavioural economies and the scientific surveillance and management of the atmosphere. According to advanced liberal neoliberal government, the market acts as the predominant driver and organising mechanism for the state around climate change mitigation and adaptation options, such as carbon economies, green labour, financial products such as derivatives, framed around the calculating and entrepreneurial individual. These strategies are deployed through technologies of performance, for example, emissions targets, the Kyoto Protocol or Copenhagen. So according to a Foucauldian reading, climate change governmentality is shaped around a series of political rationalities and the circulation of power and knowledge through a series of apparatus. For example, governmental and educational institutions, such as climate change ministries, schools, the media, museums, part of that, the market, Kyoto, Copenhagen, political subjectivities, forms of social control and techniques such as policy and research, and technologies of self, governing our own conduct to promote attitudinal and behavioural shifts. Our research suggests very strongly that museums are linked into moralising and reforming behavioural economies around climate change, likened to biopower, as pedagogic, disciplinary reformatories on the basis of valued and authoritative information sources. And the top 5 roles currently perceived for Australian museums through an online survey that we did was, according to 76% communicating leading-edge climate change science, 75% presenting a range of views on climate change, 73% by providing access to a range of resources, and 71% information on how individuals might change their lifestyles and consumer options to reduce emissions. So our research also clearly shows this double movement between the institution providing information as an influencing, reforming entity and the individual acting on themselves and changing their attitudes and conduct. 70% said they use this information to inform their own views, opinions and actions. The US sample, taken in New York City and New York State, was similar, with one noticeable difference being that 70% saw institutions as spaces to examine climate change as a broader cultural, economic, technological and social, as well as a scientific issue. Now, the recent exhibition Climate Change Your Choice at the Australian Museum, and Bob will talk more about this, supports this, encouraging the rational citizen to do something, act to reduce their carbon footprint, as opposed to doing nothing, leading to inevitable climate catastrophe. Museums are also seen as governing structures and flows of finance, capital and technology as part of market-based solutions such as emissions trading and alternative energy sources. These governmentality flows are seen in the Energy Quest exhibition at Liberty Science Centre and the Waters of Tuvalu, a Nation at Risk at Museum Victoria. And these two institutions are partners on the grant, in which market forces are seen as a solution to reduce emissions and to develop renewable energy in order to alleviate the problem of sea level rise, for example. Risk is another governmental form. Here, risk acts as a technique for governing uncertainty and catastrophe, in which its assessment is used to manage and insure against the unknown. Risk has emerged as an important objective of contemporary market and governmental rationalities in climate change governance. And to this end, museums are part of a wider collective of institutions from government and agencies such as health, financial markets, statistics, insurance, science institutions and NGOs as instruments for climate change risk management and minimisation. Like the Foucauldian idea of discipline, understanding museums' roles in risk is one of an insurial or preventionist imaginary, acting as risk spreading, responsibilisation and risk minimisation mechanisms within these collectives. To this end, they are invested along with other institutions in the identification, measurement and representation of these risk calculations through science, the primary means from which climate risk as a global crisis is formulated. Like Foucauldian discipline, it involves responsibilising the individual to manage climate change risk through their conduct. And this resonates with Beck's individualisation and neoliberal thesis, which is a defining quality of risk society. But unlike the discipline thesis, the risk mode of address is different. The responsibilisation and individualisation process orientates the individual's conduct towards the inevitability of climate change, expanding temporal horizons to the far future, and responsibilising conduct itself through the assumption of a calculating, anticipatory regard for the future, highlighting the consequences of their decisions, even if it exacerbates the anxieties and uncertainties about climate catastrophe. For example, the Waters of Tuvalu exhibition made climate change threats real through images of high tides and flooding. The emphasis on risk future orientations and calculations and the apportioning of responsibility in individual decisions, rather than just the consequences of events, can be seen in two exhibitions: The Sciences of Survival at the Science Museum in London and also Climate Change Your Choice at the Australian Museum. Both used interactives that present future projections of climate scenarios. With the former, participants are invited to make decisions about new technologies for providing safe drinking water, and the latter, images of sea level rise based on scientific risk assessment, challenging the viewer to reduce their carbon footprint. So here the temporal orientation of museums and programming is shifting, with the risk and insurential imaginary to which many science and technology museums and science centres are now engaged. The future of the planet is inscribed in the immediacy of the present. In line with this, the aim here is to induce the individual into a sustained form of life and mode of conduct in which the future appears as an object of reflexive calculation, available to calculative strategies of day-to-day contact. And here museums act as moral technologies and reformatories, making the individual responsible as one that possesses the means to repair its effects. Now, just turning back to Foucault, within the climate change governmentality stable, Foucauldian governmentality has been reworked many times. New governmentalities have been formed around new subjects and rationalities out of contemporary climate change discourses. And the range of actors has been extended in line with neoliberal formations and transnational movements. And these include Rutherford's eco-politics, eco-power, extending biopolitics to the management of all life forms. Luke's green governmentality, market mechanisms in a transnational context. Hage's ecological modernisation, combining elements of the free market and biopower, focusing on the economic cost benefits of various adaptation and mitigations of options. Backstrand and Lovebrand's civic environmentalism, which sees social movements as governing entities. In all these discourses, museums are positioned as an institutional form that is primarily disciplinary, working alongside others, where normative values and relations are expressed and legitimated, and as sites for managing citizens' actions and beliefs. One of the main benefits of a Foucauldian, and indeed risk reading, is the ability to sharply focus the domination of certain governmental strategies, their disciplinary effects and competing subjectivities. However, these reworkings, although attempting to compensate for the inflexibility of existing forms, is still based on the same formulaic. They all conflate climate change governance and futures into a series of discrete, static, non-interacting concepts formulated around a specific rationalities for discursive analysis. And it fetishizes what already exists and the roles and analysis of museums in this mix. That is, the analysis of actual forms to discover their predetermined properties, mechanisms and disciplinary effects. There's also an overemphasis on power and its deployment to imagine climate change as a cultural phenomenon. Similarly with museums, power and its circulation, as I see, is just one aspect. A heavy reliance on social constructivists and discourse analysis views climate change as in the cultural field as products of discursive struggles between subjectivities around particular techniques and configurations of state and power. And movement and change and the emergence of other alternatives is derived solely from what emerges in the in-between spaces within these discursive struggles. And one example is civic environmentalism, which emerged out of an analysis of the Kyoto Protocol and struggles between the rationalities of biopower, advanced liberal government and ecological modernisation. If alternative governmental strategies are not evident in these discursive struggles, they don't appear visible. Foucauldian governmentality are concepts where lines of inquiry are based on the analysis of a particular political rationality, where each of the elements to be analysed within the ensemble are concept dependent, a limiting frame for imagining both emergent and alternative governance strategy. Clearly, climate change governmentality's actual and potential can't be captured in this sort of stable concept. Now, institutional visibility in climate change governmentality emerges from the operation within a particular political rationality. And here, institutional analysis involves the tracing of the movement of knowledge power and its resistive forces across particular subjects, as well as double movements between technologies of domination, the museum, and technologies of self, and where visitors are posted as a one-dimensional frame as rational and responsible citizens. And finally, I ask how relevant is a governmentalities thesis developed for the analysis of the rise of the modern state to contemporary society, where unities of composition are disappearing and in which mobility, complexity and uncertainty are defining elements. Now, liquid governmentalities is a concept and method of analysis. It conceives of climate change governmentality as a process as opposed to a search for the meaning of existing forms. It engages a different ontology of the social and different spatial forms, the space of flows and systems theory, informed by Bauman's liquid modernity, Urey's global complexity and Deleuze-Guattari and Delander's assemblages. Bauman's contribution to my reformation of Foucault's governmentality to one of liquid governmentalities as an ontological device liquefies the governmentality apparatus. It solves the problem of circulation based on one modality, power, by emphasising the diverse modes of circulation and movement and complex connectivity and relationality across bodies and entities. So, liquid governmentalities operate within flows as spaces of energetic possibility, exhibiting different intensities and stresses that are non-linear, open, mobile and unpredictable. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari call the strata. Flows in liquid governmentalities are made up of matter of different forms and shapes, including human and non-human components and energy, the building blocks, each having their own various properties, capacities and causalities. And it's within these flows that climate change assemblages actualise, or as Delander suggests, catalyse, as stable entities with collective properties, acting as attractors and reinforced through positive feedback loops. Here assemblages and their components link, interact and emerge as well as dissipate. Components in a liquid governmentality frame are linked by what Deleuze and Guattari call relations of exteriority, a machinic process rather than analysis of the process of production. So here components as material and expressive forms, both human and non-human, relating to climate change governmentalities are concept independent. They're not bound within a particular concept as a political rationality such as biopower would suppose, nor are their properties predetermined, but rather are free to move, interact, assemble and disassemble with others as in a creative process in which new and different connections might emerge. In conceiving climate change governmentalities as assemblages and their operation and means of analysis, I engaged Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the plane of organisation and the plane of immanence. Climate change science, for an example, is an assembly of material elements, networks of scientists involved in the techno-scientific surveillance of the planet, greenhouse gases, atmosphere, oceans, the Arctic, Antarctic polar ice caps, computers, Kyoto Protocol, transnational, national, federal and local government policy, populations, expressive elements such as the IPCC reports, data, climate modelling and simulations, media images, conversations, meetings, political lobbying and climate change skeptics. Now the properties of an assemblage such as these emerge through the interaction of these elements, and it's reinforced or territorialised by material and expressive elements such as Gore's movie The Inconvenient Truth, and deterritorialised by climate change skeptics, for example. So here the concept of change and constant movement can be conceptualised on the basis of territorialising, assembling and deterritorialisation, disassembling processes. And one of the advantages of this idea is the ability to see climate change governmentality as mobile assemblages and as a series of components that link across all scales. Local carbon emissions reduction initiatives linked to the larger climate change science assemblage and to Copenhagen. The IPCC report, for example, plugs into and acts as a catalyst in the emergence of climate change economics through the Stern report, and also nationally to the Garnow report. And here Urey's distinct spatial patterns come into play, in which the movement of matter components and assemblages can be traced and scaled through distinct spatial and geographical markers. An assemblage can be thought of and mobilised around a concept, an expressive element or a material form, and it has multifarious entry points. Now the plane of organisation is not dissimilar to Foucault's ensemble. Foucault views fluidity and unpredictability here in terms of the circulation of power. With a focus on machinic processes, however, the emphasis on the subject-object breaks down. Foucault's governmentalities, techniques and risk as a government can therefore be rethought of as both components and assemblages within themselves. The operation and power and the analysis of the conduct, so central to Foucault, becomes just one of the capacities of the various components of an assemblage. Now, by examining Deleuze and Guattari's plane of immanence, a new form of analysis emerged in climate change governmentalities, the process of becoming, in the making and emergence. That is the analysis of the capacities and qualities of various components within assemblages according to affectual states, emotions, passions, thoughts, desires, beliefs, opinions and concepts. And these are actually all produced virtually. They're in a state of being real, but they're not actual. So there's something in the making. And these virtualities do have an important directive role in any governmental project, and they're always part of a component's duration, but they're regularly overlooked due to an emphasis on the actual. Now, subjectivity is also reworked, no longer connected to disciplinary power and capital, but also concerns change in movement through affect and desire, also giving rise to territorialisation, deterritorialisation, the strengthening or destabilisation of assemblages. Other key concepts include Deleuze and Guattari's multiplicities, the analysis of components as a multiplicity, forms in different states on both planes rather than just the multiple. Now, museums as institutional forms, both new and old, can be viewed as assemblages, liquid museums. That is, rather than closed spaces and as solid fixed entities, analysed as an apparatus in the service of a particular political rationality, but as a process, as a heterogeneous fluid open system always in the move, in the process of becoming and made up of components of material and expressive forms, exhibiting different capacities, but also linked to assemblages, other assemblages. So here relationships between the various components as an institution, their connections, interactions and link to wider public culture are based on relations of exteriority, essentially broadening the ways institutions might be thought of, linked into and considered across various scales and analysed, for example, as components in financial markets. It also offers a way of creatively exploring other options and other relationships with other climate change governmentality assemblages. For example, how can institutions work with NGOs and other political entities considered that they're viewed erroneously as apolitical? What are the opportunities and limits? And we're exploring these and many other sort of ideas. Now, in considering museums as assemblages, all the same criteria apply. They operate in the space of flows on both planes, exhibit territorialising and deterritorialising processes. Organisations, for example, are reinforced through policy, through notions of trust and legitimacy, but they're also deterritorialised through developments such as Web 2.0, which challenges institutions as authoritative content producers. A Foucauldian disciplinary and Beck risk reading of the museum in climate change governmentality is not precluded, but rather thought of in new ways as a mobile and emergent process along with others. At the individual level, audiences are conceived as assemblages as unique, historical and historically contingent, rather than as more a one-dimensional rational citizen in an objective discipline. In summary, according to liquid governmentalities, climate change governmentality becomes a complex system of multi-scaled assemblages within global flows, both actual and in the making, made up of a heterogeneous mix of components comprising hybrids of physical, social and cultural elements and material and expressive forms such as actions and statements. Or each of these components come together in various combinations, have their own properties, interact, compete, emerge and dissipate within transnational flows. Now, the combinational richness, openness, mobility and emergent qualities of liquid governmentalities allows the possibility of different governmental solutions to emerge. It allows us to view the present and the future in different ways, to observe interactions between the multifarious discourses as a creative process in the formation of climate change governmentalities, and see the future as interactions of the possible, the actual, and as a process of becoming. The capacities to affect and actualise, however, vary. Now, engaging the idea of liquid governmentalities allows us to look beyond established ideologies and relations between the state, science, the market, and environmental politics to which museums form part, construct and legitimise, to consider and offer some other alternatives and to see how others might be incorporated into this mix. It's a concept at this stage. It's just in a process of being tested, and I've yet to critique its uses and limits. And I think the complexity element's going to be a big challenge, but we'll see how that goes. So thank you.
We thought today that, given the nature of the event, we might just have any clarifications now, and then have Brett's presentation, and then have a wide discussion after that. So has anyone got any burning questions?
I had a really quick small thing I wanted to ask was about the surveys.
Yeah.
The New York and Australian. Do you have any climate skeptics or try to see if skeptics go to museums?
The skeptic cohort was quite small from what we can ascertain. Ben, do you want to make a comment? It was pretty small, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Surprisingly small, yeah. It is small anyway. They're just very vocal, basically.
And all employed by the Bush.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Fiona.